The first luxury SUV rolled to a stop in front of Brooks Auto Repair before the demolition crew had even finished unloading their equipment.
I'm not going anywhere with you.
"What in the world?" Samuel Brooks muttered from his folding chair beside the garage's front office, where he'd been sitting every morning for the past 3 weeks, watching strangers measure his life's work for a wrecking ball. A second SUV pulled in behind the first, then a third. Men in dark suits stepped out, speaking quietly into earpieces, forming a loose perimeter around the cracked asphalt lot, as though guarding something far more important than an old mechanic and a condemned building. A helicopter passed low overhead, circling once, before continuing toward a clearing behind the property. Samuel gripped the arms of his chair and pushed himself up slowly, his knees protesting the movement the way they had for the past several years. Whatever this was, it wasn't the bank sending appraisers, and it definitely wasn't the demolition crew's supervisor. He'd learned to recognize the particular quiet of powerful people arriving somewhere they intended to be obeyed, and this had all the hallmarks of exactly that. The rear door of the lead SUV opened, and a man stepped out into the afternoon light. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dressed in a simply tailored dark suit that nonetheless radiated the specific weight of enormous wealth, the kind that didn't need logos or flash to announce itself. He paused for a moment beside the car door, looking at the garage with an expression Samuel couldn't quite place. Something between grief and homecoming. "Can I help you?" Samuel called out, his voice rougher than he intended. Equal parts suspicion and exhaustion after 3 weeks of watching his shop get measured for destruction. The man walked toward him slowly, crossing the cracked lot with unhurried steps, until he stood close enough that Samuel could see his eyes clearly for the first time. "You once asked if I'd eaten," the man said quietly, 25 years ago, behind this garage, in the cold, before you knew my name." Samuel's breath caught somewhere in his chest. "I've spent 25 years trying to find a way to thank you for that question," the man said, and knelt, right there on the cracked asphalt, in front of an old mechanic who hadn't recognized him at all until that exact moment. "Dad, I'm finally home." If that moment just gave you chills, you're going to want to see exactly how this story got here. Hit subscribe now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and stay with us, because everything that led to this moment started 25 years earlier, on one of the coldest nights of Samuel Brooks's life. Samuel Brooks had run Brooks Auto Repair out of the same cinderblock garage on the edge of town for nearly 30 years, ever since his own father had handed him the keys and told him a good mechanic's word was worth more than any warranty a dealership could print. He'd buried his wife 11 years earlier, raised his son Daniel mostly alone through his teenage years, and settled into the particular loneliness of a man whose hands stayed busy so his mind wouldn't have room to dwell on what the quiet house felt like after dark. "You work too much for a man your age," his neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, told him more than once. "When was the last time you took a day off that wasn't a Sunday you spent fixing your own truck instead of someone else's?" "Can't remember," Samuel admitted, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "Guess the shop's the only thing that still makes sense some days." It was on one of those late evenings, locking up after a longer shift than usual, that Samuel noticed the shape curled against the back wall of the garage, half hidden behind an oil drum, small enough that he almost mistook it for a stray dog before he heard the shivering breath. "Hey," Samuel said gently, crouching down with his flashlight lowered so it wouldn't shine directly into whoever's face he was about to find. "You all right back there?" A boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old, flinched back against the wall, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, clothes far too thin for the near-freezing night. "I'm not stealing anything," the boy said quickly, voice shaking from cold rather than fear alone. "I'll go. Please don't call anyone." "Nobody's calling anybody," Samuel said, lowering himself carefully onto the cold concrete so he wasn't looming over the child. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan," the boy said, after a hesitation that suggested he'd considered lying, and decided for reasons Samuel wouldn't understand until later, that this particular stranger didn't feel worth lying to. Ethan Reyes. "Have you eaten today, Ethan?" The boy's silence answered the question more completely than words could have. Samuel didn't call social services that night, though he knew, even then, that it was probably what the situation technically called for. Instead, he brought Ethan into the small office at the back of the garage, turned the space heater up as high as it would go, and drove to the all-night diner 3 blocks away for the biggest plate of food the menu offered. "Eat slow," Samuel told him, watching the boy nearly inhale the first few bites before catching himself. "Nobody's taking it from you. Eat slow, or you'll make yourself sick." Between bites, haltingly, Ethan's story came out in pieces. Both parents dead within the same year, his father to a workplace accident, his mother to an illness that might have been treatable if the family had carried insurance they couldn't afford. No aunts, no uncles, no family willing or able to take him in. 3 different foster placements in 8 months, each one ending with Ethan running rather than staying somewhere that felt more dangerous than the street. "I don't steal," Ethan said, with a fierce kind of pride that seemed too old for his small frame. "I've been hungry plenty of times. I don't steal. My mom always said a person's word is the only thing that's really theirs." "Sounds like your mother and my father would have gotten along," Samuel said. He used to say something almost exactly like that. That night, Ethan slept on a cot Samuel set up in the garage's back office, and in the morning, rather than the county services number Samuel had told himself he'd call, he found himself instead buying the boy a proper set of clothes from the discount store 2 towns over, where nobody would recognize either of them, and ask questions Samuel didn't yet have answers for. "This isn't permanent," Samuel told himself out loud, alone in his truck, more than once during those first weeks. "Just until I figure out the right thing to do." The right thing to do, it turned out, took the shape of 6 months of Ethan sleeping in that back office, helping sweep the garage floor after school, eating dinner across from Samuel at a kitchen table that had felt too large and too quiet for exactly 11 years. "You don't have to keep doing chores to earn your keep," Samuel told him one evening, watching the boy scrub grease off a wrench with more focus than most adults brought to their actual jobs. "This isn't a trade, Ethan. You're not paying rent." "I know," Ethan said, not looking up from the wrench. "I just like understanding how things work, and I like being useful. People don't usually let me stick around long enough to figure out if I'm any good at something." "You're plenty good at plenty of things," Samuel said. "Give it time. You'll see." 6 months became a year, and a year became the paperwork Samuel had put off, out of fear more than reluctance. Fear that a judge somewhere might decide a widowed mechanic in his 50s wasn't a suitable home for a boy who'd already lost everything once. The judge, as it turned out, needed only one look at the careful, steady way Ethan answered questions about his life with Samuel to grant the adoption without hesitation. "Congratulations, Mr. Brooks," the judge said, signing the final document. "You have a son, Samuel's biological son, Daniel, 17 at the time, and already living most of his life at a distance from his father, even before Ethan arrived, did not share in the judge's easy certainty. "You're replacing me," Daniel said flatly. The first time Samuel brought up the adoption at the dinner table, Ethan sitting quietly beside him, trying to make himself as small as possible in the middle of a conversation that clearly wasn't meant for him. "Nobody's replacing anybody," Samuel said. "There's room in this family for both of you." "There's room in the will for both of us, you mean?" Daniel said. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Some stray kid you found behind the garage, and now he gets to split whatever's left of this place with me?" "Daniel, I'm not wrong, am I?" Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping hard against the floor. "You spent my whole childhood at that shop instead of at home, and now you're handing half of what's left to someone you've known for a year." Ethan, silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice small but steady. "I didn't ask for any of this. I don't want to take anything from you. You already have, Daniel said, and walked out of the house without finishing his dinner, a pattern that would repeat itself with increasing frequency over the years that followed. That jealousy hardened over time into something colder and more deliberate than a teenager's wounded pride, though it would be years before its full weight came due. School offered Ethan little relief from the tension building at home. Teachers, informed of his background before ever meeting him, made quiet assumptions about what kind of student a formerly homeless foster child would be. "Let's not set expectations too high for this one," Ethan overheard his 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Callahan, tell a colleague in the hallway, unaware he was close enough to hear. "Kids with backgrounds like his rarely catch up academically. We'll do what we can." He caught up anyway, quietly, stubbornly, staying up long after Samuel had gone to bed, to work through math textbooks, 2 grade levels ahead of his actual coursework, driven by something that felt less like ambition and more like a refusal to let anyone's low expectations become the ceiling of what he actually was. The bullying, when it came, drew directly from the same well of assumption. Garage trash, a classmate named Kyle liked to call him, loud enough for a cluster of students to hear near the lockers. "Bet your real parents didn't want you either. That's usually how it works." Ethan absorbed comments like that with the same quiet endurance he'd learned surviving on the street, rarely giving anyone the satisfaction of a visible reaction, though the words accumulated somewhere beneath the surface, in a place that would eventually need decades to fully unclench. "You never fight back," Samuel observed one evening, noticing a fresh scrape on Ethan's knuckles that hadn't come from garage work. "Not that I'm encouraging fighting, just noticing. Fighting back just gives them a story to tell about how the garage kid attacked someone," Ethan said. "I'd rather give them nothing to work with." "That's a heavier kind of strength than most grown men manage," Samuel said. "I'm proud of you for it. Doesn't mean I like watching you carry it." The scrape, it turned out, had come from Kyle shoving him into a locker hard enough to draw blood, an incident Ethan hadn't planned on mentioning until Samuel noticed the torn skin himself while they worked on an engine together that evening. "Who did this?" Samuel asked, setting down his wrench, his voice carrying a quiet intensity Ethan rarely heard from him. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said. "It's not the first time. It won't be the last. I can handle it." "It matters to me," Samuel said. "You shouldn't have to handle anything alone, Ethan. Not while you're living under my roof." "You already gave me a home when nobody else would," Ethan said. "I'm not going to make you fight my battles too. Some things I need to carry myself, so I know I can." Samuel didn't push further that night, though he showed up at the school the following morning regardless. A conversation with the principal that Ethan never fully learned the details of, except that Kyle's shoves stopped entirely within the week. What Ethan carried alongside the bullying and low expectations was a growing, almost obsessive fascination with how things worked mechanically, a fascination Samuel fed without fully understanding, at first, the scale of what he was nurturing. "Show me again how the carburetor's supposed to mix the air and fuel," Ethan asked one evening, hunched over an engine with Samuel's old flashlight clenched between his teeth. "You've asked me that 4 times this month," Samuel said, laughing despite himself. "You understand it better than half the mechanics I trained." "I want to understand it better than all of them," Ethan said. "I keep thinking there's a better way to do it, a cleaner way. I just haven't figured it out yet." At night, long after the garage closed, Ethan buried himself in library books on engineering, borrowed and reborrowed, until the librarian simply started setting new arrivals aside for him without being asked. By 16, he'd sketched out a modification to a standard combustion engine that reduced fuel waste by a margin significant enough that a local mechanic, a gruff old-timer named Pete, who'd known Samuel for 30 years, actually built a working version in his own shop out of curiosity. "Where'd this kid learn to think like this?" Pete asked Samuel, staring at the modified engine running smoother and more efficiently than anything either of them had built by hand before. This isn't hobby-level tinkering, Sam. This is real. He learned it from staying up past midnight with library books while the rest of us were asleep, Samuel said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. That boy's going to do something extraordinary someday. I believe that all the way down. What Samuel didn't yet know was how little time he had left to watch that belief unfold under his own roof. The trouble at the shop had been building quietly for over a year by the time it finally broke through the surface. A regional auto parts distributor, Brooks Auto Repair, had depended on for decades folded unexpectedly, forcing Samuel into more expensive supply contracts that ate into margins already thin from years of competing against corporate chains with pricing power he could never match. Bank notices arrived with increasing frequency, each one a little more urgent than the last. Daniel, 24 by then, and working, unenthusiastically, as an assistant at the shop while nursing years of resentment he'd never fully set down, saw an opportunity in his father's mounting desperation. "There's a woman interested in the property," Daniel told his father one evening, phrasing it carefully, the way he'd rehearsed. "Victoria Kane runs a development firm. She'd pay enough to clear every debt on this place and leave you comfortable besides." "I'm not selling my father's shop," Samuel said flatly. "Not while I've still got hands that can turn a wrench. Even if it means losing everything anyway when the bank forecloses," Daniel pressed. "At least this way you walk away with something." "I said no, Daniel." What Samuel didn't know, and wouldn't discover for weeks, was that Daniel had already begun meeting privately with Victoria Kane's legal team, using power of attorney documents he'd convinced his father to sign years earlier during a health scare. Documents meant only to handle medical decisions if Samuel were ever incapacitated, quietly repurposed to authorize a property sale his father had explicitly refused. "This is for his own good," Daniel told Victoria Kane's attorney, signing the final paperwork in a downtown office far from the garage where his father still believed the shop's future remained undecided. "He'll thank me eventually, once he's not drowning in debt anymore." The betrayal surfaced 3 weeks later, when a certified letter arrived at the shop informing Samuel the property had already changed ownership, the sale finalized under authority Daniel had never disclosed he'd used. "You had no right," Samuel said, standing in his own kitchen, holding the letter with hands that shook harder than they had in years. Ethan standing frozen in the doorway, having walked in on the confrontation already underway. "This was my father's shop, Daniel. Mine to decide, not yours. I was trying to save you from watching the bank take it anyway, with nothing to show for it," Daniel shot back, though the justification sounded thinner even to his own ears than it had in the lawyer's office. "You should be thanking me." "Thanking you," Samuel repeated, disbelief cracking his voice. "You used documents I signed to protect myself if I ever couldn't make my own medical decisions. You twisted my trust into a weapon against the one thing I've spent my whole life building." "It's just a building, Dad. A pile of concrete and old tools." "It was never just a building," Samuel said. "It was your grandfather's hands on every wall. It was 30 years of keeping a promise to a man who isn't here to see what you did with his name. Maybe if you'd spent half as much energy protecting our family instead of that garage, none of this would have happened in the first place," Daniel said, years of buried resentment finally spilling out unfiltered. "I watched you love this place more than you loved being home for dinner half my childhood. And now you're standing here, acting like I've committed some unforgivable crime for trying to get you out from under it." "Get out of this house," Samuel said, his voice breaking on the words in a way Ethan had never once heard from him. "Get out, before I say something I can't take back." Daniel left that night and didn't return for years. The shop closed within the month, the property already legally beyond Samuel's ability to reclaim. Decades of his father's legacy reduced to boxes of tools Samuel packed alone in the empty garage, while Ethan, 17 now, watched from the doorway with a guilt he couldn't shake loose, no matter how many times Samuel insisted none of it was his fault. If I hadn't come here, Ethan said quietly, one of the last nights before the final closing, Daniel wouldn't have hated you, wouldn't have done this. This is because of me. This is because of Daniel's choices, Samuel said firmly, gripping his son's shoulder the way he had the very first night they'd met. Not yours. Don't you dare carry his weight on top of everything you've already carried. I still feel like I owe you something I can never pay back. You don't owe me anything, Ethan. That's not how this family works. I'm going to pay it back anyway, Ethan said, with the same quiet, immovable conviction he'd carried since the night he refused to steal food he desperately needed. I don't know how yet, but I promise you, I'll come back when I can repay everything you've done for me. You don't need to come back with anything, Samuel said. Just come back. I will, Ethan said. When I've earned the right to. He left for college on a full academic scholarship 2 months later, and for the first several years, letters and phone calls came steadily, full of news about coursework and late nights in engineering labs. Then, gradually, the calls grew shorter, the letters less frequent, swallowed by the demands of a life Samuel understood less and less from a distance, until eventually, silence settled in where his son's voice used to be. If you're wondering whether Ethan ever came back, stay with us, because what happens over the next several years will completely change how you see this story. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe now, because the biggest turn is still ahead. What Samuel didn't see, in the years of silence that followed, was the sheer scale of what his son was quietly building. Ethan's college years were defined less by comfort than by an almost punishing determination, working 2 jobs alongside a full course load, sleeping in libraries more often than his own dorm room, driven by a hunger for something beyond simple survival, for the first time in his life. His engineering professors quickly recognized what Pete the mechanic had noticed years earlier in a small-town garage, that Ethan didn't just understand mechanical systems, he saw possibilities within them that experienced engineers overlooked entirely. This modification you're proposing, his thesis advisor, Dr. Okonkwo, told him during his final year, studying blueprints spread across her desk, could genuinely reduce energy loss in electric drivetrain systems by a margin the industry hasn't achieved yet. Have you considered patenting this before you publish anything? I've considered a lot of things, Ethan said. Mostly, I've considered whether anyone's going to take a proposal seriously from someone who slept behind a garage until he was 12. The proposal doesn't know where you slept, Dr. Okonkwo said. It only knows whether it works. And this one works. It took 3 more years, 4 failed startup attempts, and investors who dismissed him in meeting after meeting before one small venture capital firm finally saw what Dr. Okonkwo had seen years earlier. Every other founder who's pitched us this quarter promised incremental improvements. The investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Whitfield, told him after his 5th attempt at securing funding, "You're the only one who's shown me something that could actually change the entire industry's baseline efficiency standard. I'm in. But I need to know you can survive the failures that are absolutely coming before this succeeds." "I've survived worse than failed funding rounds," Ethan said quietly. "I think I'll manage." What followed was 5 brutal years of near collapses, manufacturing setbacks that nearly bankrupted the company twice, and a breakthrough drivetrain technology that eventually reduced energy loss in electric vehicles by a margin significant enough to catch the attention of every major automotive manufacturer simultaneously. The lowest point came in the 3rd year, when a manufacturing partner's factory fire destroyed 18 months of prototype components, 2 weeks before a critical investor demonstration, leaving Ethan standing in a scorched warehouse at 2 in the morning with Diane Whitfield on the phone, her voice carefully controlled but unmistakably grim. "I need you to tell me honestly whether this company survives this," Diane said, "because if it doesn't, I need to protect what's left of my fund's exposure now, not in 3 weeks. Give me 72 hours, Ethan said, standing amid the wreckage of nearly 2 years of work. I'm not walking away from this because of one fire. He didn't sleep for those 72 hours, rebuilding a working demonstration model from salvaged parts and sheer stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had once kept a hungry 11-year-old from stealing food he desperately needed. The demonstration, when it finally happened, was rougher than planned. Held together with visible seams and exposed wiring, Ethan didn't bother hiding from the investors. "This isn't the polished version I promised you," Ethan told the room of skeptical investors. "But it works, and it proves the concept survives even when everything else falls apart around it. I'm asking you to bet on that resilience, not on a perfect prototype." Diane Whitfield was the only investor in the room who didn't walk out that day. By the time Ethan turned 34, Forbes had already run 3 separate cover stories, calling him the youngest self-made billionaire in the country's history. His company's technology licensed across a dozen major manufacturers. His net worth climbing past the $4 billion mark within 18 months of his company's public offering. None of it, not the magazine covers, not the private jets, not the boardrooms full of executives eager for his approval, ever fully quieted the specific memory that had started all of it. A cold night behind a cinder-block garage, and a stranger's simple question about whether he'd eaten. "You never talk about where you actually came from," a journalist asked him once, during one of the rare interviews he agreed to. "Every profile mentions foster care and a difficult childhood in vague terms, but never any real specifics. Some parts of a story aren't finished yet," Ethan said. "I'll tell it properly when it's ready to be told properly." What he didn't say, because he wasn't ready to say it publicly yet, was that he'd spent years quietly trying to track down the man who'd raised him, only to find, through a private investigator he'd hired discreetly 5 years earlier, that Brooks Auto Repair no longer existed. The property sold years ago under circumstances the investigator's initial report couldn't fully explain. "I need you to find him," Ethan told the investigator, a careful woman named Marisol who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet, personal search work. Not the property, him, Samuel Brooks, wherever he is. It took Marisol 4 months to locate Samuel, living alone in a small rented apartment, 2 towns over from where the garage had once stood, his health declining, his son Daniel having vanished from his life entirely years earlier, after the property sale that broke their relationship beyond easy repair. "He's not doing well," Marisol reported back, her voice careful in the way people's voices got when they had to deliver news they knew would land hard. "Financially strained, his health has been declining for the past 2 years. Heart trouble, mostly, complicated by not having consistent access to good care. And there's something else you should know. Tell me. The property where the garage used to stand, it's been sitting condemned and abandoned for years, since the corporation that bought it went under. The city's finally scheduled it for demolition, in 3 weeks." Ethan sat with that information for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that Marisol, despite years of delivering difficult news to powerful people, found herself unable to fully read. "Cancel the demolition," Ethan said finally. "Whatever it costs, whatever paperwork needs filing, cancel it immediately, and find out everything about how that sale happened. Every signature, every document, every name attached to it. If you were Ethan, discovering after all these years exactly how far things had fallen apart, what would you have done first? Comment below and let us know. And if this story already has you invested, make sure you've subscribed, because the return is coming, and it's going to be worth every second of the wait." What the investigation revealed over the following 2 weeks was a more complete and damning picture than even Ethan had expected. Daniel's forged authorization, buried in property records for over a decade, had never been contested because Samuel, devastated and broke in the aftermath, had lacked both the money and the will to pursue a legal fight against his own son. Victoria Kane's development firm had, in fact, gone bankrupt 8 years after the purchase, the property passing through 2 subsequent corporate owners before finally landing, condemned and forgotten, in the city's demolition queue. "I want the property back," Ethan told his legal team, gathered in a conference room, 40 floors above a city Samuel had never once visited. "I don't care what it costs, or how many corporate entities it's passed through since. I want it back, and I want it back before that demolition date." "That's certainly achievable, given your resources," his lead attorney said. "May I ask why this particular property, out of everything your company could be investing in?" "Because it's not an investment," Ethan said. "It's where someone gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. That's worth more than anything on your balance sheets." The purchase closed 9 days before the scheduled demolition. Ethan's legal team working around the clock to ensure every document was airtight, every prior claim fully resolved, every trace of the corporate ownership that had let the building rot for years finally cleared away. He arrived himself, rather than sending representatives, on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 25 years after the night Samuel had found him shivering behind that same garage wall. Samuel, sitting in his folding chair, watching strangers in expensive suits step out of luxury vehicles he assumed belonged to some development company, finally coming to finish what Victoria Kane had started decades earlier, didn't recognize the man walking toward him at all. Not the tailored suit, not the confident stride. None of it matched the boy he still pictured, frozen in memory at 11 years old, thin and cold and refusing to steal. Then the man knelt in front of him on the cracked asphalt and said the words that broke 25 years of silence wide open. "You once asked if I'd eaten," Ethan said. "I've spent 25 years trying to find a way to thank you for that question. Dad, I'm finally home." Samuel's hands found the sides of the young man's face, searching, disbelieving, tears already falling before his voice could catch up to what his eyes were finally recognizing. "Ethan, my God. Ethan, is that really you?" "It's me," Ethan said, his own composure, carefully maintained through boardrooms and investor pitches, and 100 difficult negotiations, finally cracking entirely. "I'm so sorry it took this long. I'm so sorry I let so many years go by." "You're here now," Samuel said, pulling his son into an embrace that neither of them seemed willing to break first. "That's all that matters. You're here now." They sat together on the cracked asphalt for nearly an hour, the executives and demolition crew waiting at a respectful distance, while Samuel told him everything: Daniel's disappearance, the property's collapse into corporate limbo, the years of declining health made harder by loneliness, rather than any single dramatic hardship. "I should have found you sooner," Ethan said, guilt evident beneath every word. "I hired an investigator years ago, and still let it take this long." "You were building something," Samuel said. "I don't need an apology for that. I just need you to know, I never stopped believing you'd come back. Not once. Not even during the years when everyone else told me I should stop hoping." "I made you a promise," Ethan said. "I don't break promises. It just took longer than either of us wanted it to." What followed over the next several weeks moved with a speed that left the small town buzzing with a story that quickly outgrew local news coverage entirely. Ethan didn't simply restore Samuel's health, arranging immediately for the finest cardiac specialists to take over his care. He didn't simply rebuild the shop, though he did that too, restoring Brooks Auto Repair exactly as Samuel remembered it, down to the same faded sign above the door, and the same brand of coffee Samuel had always kept in the back office. He also, quietly and without announcing it publicly beforehand, opened an investigation into exactly how the original sale had been authorized. An investigation that led directly back to Daniel, now in his 50s, living several states away, under circumstances considerably less comfortable than the money from Victoria Kane's original purchase might have suggested. Daniel arrived at the restored shop 3 weeks after Ethan's return, having heard through mutual acquaintances about his father's sudden and highly publicized change in fortune, arriving with the particular hopeful calculation of a man who'd spent years assuming his estranged family's misfortune had nothing further to offer him. "Dad," Daniel said, stepping through the newly rebuilt garage doors, finding Samuel and Ethan standing together beside the same workbench where Ethan had once scrubbed grease off wrenches as a boy. "I heard what happened. I'm glad things are looking up for you." "Are you?" Samuel said flatly, no warmth in the two words at all. "I know things have been difficult between us," Daniel said, his eyes flicking toward Ethan with poorly concealed calculation. "But I'm still your son. I was hoping we might find a way to move past everything, now that things are different." Everything is different because Ethan built something extraordinary out of nothing. The same way he built himself out of nothing when he had nowhere else to turn, Samuel said. "You forged my signature and sold my father's legacy out from under me, Daniel. I don't know what you were hoping to find here, but it isn't money." "I never meant for it to go that far," Daniel said, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine regret, or might simply have been the specific panic of watching an opportunity evaporate. "I was young. I was angry. I thought I was protecting you from bankruptcy." "You thought you were protecting your inheritance," Ethan said quietly, speaking for the first time since Daniel had entered. "I don't say that with anger, Daniel. I understand jealousy better than most people ever will. I understand what it feels like to believe you don't have enough, that someone else is taking something that should have been yours. But you had a father who loved you your entire life, and you threw that away chasing money that was never actually the thing you needed." Daniel had no answer for that, standing silently in a garage rebuilt by the very stepbrother he'd spent decades resenting. "I'm not interested in punishing you further than the consequences you've already built for yourself," Ethan continued. "But I am interested in making sure what happened here never happens to anyone else because of unchecked greed. That's where my attention is going now. Not toward revenge, toward something that actually matters." Justice Served, publication of the true circumstances behind Daniel's forgery, brought its own quiet reckoning without Ethan needing to pursue anything further than making the truth simply, plainly known throughout a town that had spent decades assuming Samuel's misfortune had been an unavoidable business failure rather than a betrayal. This is the moment that changes everything, not just for Samuel, but for hundreds of children who will benefit from what Ethan builds next. And if this story is moving you the way it moved everyone in that garage, drop a comment telling us what you'd do in Samuel's position, and subscribe if you haven't already, because the best part of this story is still ahead. The announcement came 6 weeks after Ethan's return, delivered not in a boardroom or a press conference downtown, but on the same cracked asphalt lot where he'd once slept behind an oil drum, now transformed into a gathering space filled with folding chairs, local reporters, and neighbors who'd known Samuel for decades. 25 years ago, a man who owed me nothing gave me everything, Ethan said, standing beside Samuel, who sat in a chair of honor near the front rather than his usual folding chair by the office door. Not money, not opportunity, in the way people usually mean that word. He gave me the simple, radical idea that I mattered, at a moment when the rest of the world had made it very clear it didn't think so. He gestured toward the newly rebuilt building behind him, and toward a second, larger structure under construction just beyond it. Brooks Auto Repair is fully restored, exactly as it was, because some things deserve to be preserved rather than improved upon. But behind it, we're building something new, the Samuel Brooks Vocational Academy, a fully funded technical and engineering school for homeless and displaced children, offering free housing, free education, and mentorship from working professionals in every trade imaginable. No child who walks through those doors will ever be asked whether they can afford to be there. Franquate. The crowd, largely composed of townspeople who'd watched Samuel's shop crumble into abandonment over the preceding years, erupted into applause that seemed to catch even Ethan slightly off guard in its intensity. Daniel, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, having come hoping for some fragment of the fortune his stepbrother now commanded, found himself instead watching hundreds of strangers applaud the father he'd abandoned decades earlier, a witness to exactly the kind of legacy his own choices had permanently excluded him from. Samuel, when it came his turn to speak, waved off the assistance Ethan offered, rising from his chair, insisting on standing under his own power for what he understood, without needing to be told, was likely to be one of the more important moments remaining in his life. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," Samuel said, his voice steadier than his failing health should have allowed. "I found a hungry boy behind my garage and asked him a simple question. I didn't make him a billionaire. I didn't teach him engineering or business or any of the things that built the company sitting in front of you today." He turned to look at Ethan, his eyes wet but his voice unwavering. "I only reminded him that he mattered. That's all any of us can really do for each other, most days. The rest, he built entirely himself." "That's not entirely true," Ethan said quietly, stepping closer, his own composure cracking slightly under the weight of the moment. "You gave me the one thing money can't manufacture, no matter how much of it a person accumulates. You gave me the belief that I was worth someone's kindness, even when I had absolutely nothing to offer in return. Everything after that, the scholarships, the company, all of it, that was just me trying to prove your belief in me hadn't been misplaced." The academy opened its doors 4 months later, its first cohort of 200 children walking through gates engraved with a single line Samuel had insisted on personally, over Ethan's initial suggestion of something more elaborate. "Everyone deserves to be asked if they've eaten." Among the first cohort was a thin, watchful girl named Priya, 12 years old, who reminded Samuel so sharply of the boy he'd found behind his garage that he found himself blinking back tears the moment she stepped through the gates, refusing help carrying her single small bag of belongings. "You don't have to carry that alone," Samuel told her gently. "There are people here who want to help." "I know," Priya said, echoing an answer Samuel had heard once before, decades earlier, in almost the exact same words. "I just like knowing I still can, if I need to." Samuel laughed, a warm, surprised sound that hadn't come easily in the years of his declining health, and looked over at Ethan, who had heard the exchange and gone quiet with recognition of his own. "Look at them," Samuel said quietly, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, the same way it had rested there countless times over the years they'd shared a home. "All of them, because you never forgot where you came from. Because you never let me believe where I came from was something to be ashamed of," Ethan said. "That's the whole difference, Dad. That's always been the whole difference." If this story reminded you that one small act of kindness can echo across generations, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Samuel's position all those years ago. And if this moved you even half as much as it moved everyone standing in that garage, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe to Billionaire Story Vault for more emotional stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.